so let's get into the politics of the 1920s and the various presidents that served. And this is chapter 32 in your text. And Warren G. Harding is our president. So he is a senator from Ohio. He's in his second term when he runs for president. He was a state senator as well. He was also a newspaper publisher. He was a self-made man and started his own newspaper publishing house. But he was truly a lousy president. He's one of the worst we've ever had. He was the most scandalous president since Grant. And he goes down in history as having led the administration with the worst scandal in American history before Watergate. So he does make some good, conscious decisions when he appoints his cabinet members. And I should point out that he was elected largely because he was a very good-looking man at the time, and they were looking for some type of polished, good-looking figure to lead the United States after the war. But he makes some good cabinet appointments. He also makes a couple of lousy ones. Charles Evans Hughes is the Secretary of State. He's excellent. He's phenomenal. Andrew Mellon, great Secretary of the Treasury. And Harding had promised he was going to surround himself with the smartest men available. Herbert Hoover, future president, Secretary of Commerce. He had led the Food Administration during World War I. These are all great appointments. Nothing wrong here. But he does appoint a couple of lousy secretaries, various cabinet positions later on, and we'll see those. He also calls for this return to normalcy, that we had been tossed and turmoiled through World War I, and the world didn't know which end was up, so this is going to be his attempt to return the United States to what he defines as normal, he really tries to promote that. And that's what wins him the election, too, is that phrase, return to normalcy. It's also a return to laissez-faire economics. The government's going to take a very hands-off approach under Harding to the economic principles in the country. In his 3 years as president, he's elected in 1920. We know something tragic's going to happen. It's a year with a zero on it. In 3 years as president, he appoints 4 Supreme Court justices. Does this make a difference? Yeah, he was able to really mess with the constructs of the court. By appointing 4 justices, he was really able to put his own people that agreed with his views on the court, and they were able to manipulate American law and legislation accordingly, depending on their views. So the Supreme Court, what do they do during his 3 years and after his 3 years? Because they're going to live well beyond his tenure as president. He also, one of the guys he appoints is, of course, former President Taft as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is going to axe progressive legislation. They go after it like crazy. They want to cut as much of that progressive stuff out of our legislation as possible. So what do they go after? Child labor laws that protect children in the workplace. They go after all the gains made by labor unions as far as working a 10-hour workday, minimum wage, those kinds of things. They go after all of that. They restrict government intervention in corporations, which means that basically any of your antitrust legislation is a moot point at this juncture. Doesn't matter because they're going to axe it, okay? The big case that happens at this time is Atkins versus Children's Hospital. And what that case does is it reverses Mueller versus Oklahoma, because what that case said was women have a peculiar structure and therefore should be granted certain workplace accommodations. Minimum wage, certain hours, blah, blah, blah. This reverses Mueller. And what it says is there are no special protections for women. They have the right to vote now. Why do they need special protections? They're just like men. And they get no minimum wage. So this applies to women, okay? So as a result of all of this laissez-faire bit, your corporations are going to expand. They're going to grow bigger and bigger. We know this is the boom period of the 1920s. After the war, there are certain things that are passed in order to get the United States back on par and make right in the world the peace effort that's happening. So the Merchant Marine Act is passed in 1920, and this was an effort by the United States to really disarm ourselves, to bring our militaries back in line with where we were pre-World War I. We don't need to have millions of men in our army. We can discharge a lot of those. give them a nice bonus, and off they go, or at least that was the intention. They don't get the bonus. But this was a real effort to disarm the United States and on ourselves. We did it ourselves to bring our armaments back in line. There are a lot of race riots that break out. A lot of African Americans had been moving north, and there was some resentment in the north about African Americans trying to join labor unions. That was a no-no. Trying to get jobs, trying to really truly be equal to other areas to other groups in the United States. The American Legion is formed after World War I, and it's formed by a guy named Colonel Theodore Roosevelt. You might recognize that name. Jr., this is his son, Theodore Roosevelt's son. He forms the American Legion, and the members of the American Legion are called the Legionnaires. And it really kind of, that's sort of a French name for their military during World War I with the Legionnaires. We sort of adopt it. But the Legionnaires, what their mission is to form a camaraderie among World War I veterans. The American Legion still exists today. They provide social and moral support for their members. They provide support for the Veterans Administration, for the Veterans Hospital. They provide support for veterans' pensions. And they really represent veterans in this country. Still today, there are over 3 million members of the American Legion today. And you might also recognize Legionnaires from Legionnaires Disease, and that came about in 1976. There was a group of veterans, American Legion members, meeting in Philadelphia. They were having a conference of sorts, and Legionnaires there were thousands of people there. Hundreds of men got sick at this conference. 34 men died as a result of their sickness. And Legionnaires' disease is caused by a bacteria that was given the name of Legionella something or other. I'm not a scientist. But it was given the name after it was discovered in 1976, after this conference when everybody got sick. They discovered that this bacteria grows in stagnant water. Gross. And it can cause Legionnaires' disease, but that name comes about as a result of this. It's kind of off topic, but I wanted to explain that. And then you have the Adjusted Compensation Act. And the Adjusted Compensation Act provides for health and death benefits upon the death of a veteran that fought in World War I. And it's sort of a way for the military to be able to say to veterans, well, we can't afford to pay you all those salaries that we sort of promised you and the bonuses we promised you, but we'll give you insurance upon your death or if you get sick. That's our adjusted compensation. And that's what that effort was. Now, in 1921, there's a joint resolution passed by Congress to try to end our part in World War I. Remember, we never signed the Treaty of Versailles. So this joint resolution is passed, and it officially ends our involvement in World War I. Unbelievable that it took that. And then they have, in 1921-22, they have the Washington Disarmament Conference. And out of that comes all 5 of the winners of World War I, so Italy, France, United Kingdom, United States, and Japan, all meet at this conference. And out of that conference comes the 5-Power Naval Treaty. And in the 5-Power Naval Treaty is a resolution to limit the size of various navies to a 5-5-3 ratio. In other words, for every 5 ships the United States had, for every 5 ships the United Kingdom had, Japan could have 3. They were a little resentful of this. Why do we only get 3? And this applied to battleships and aircraft carriers. So that's where this treaty comes from. Now, this treaty would be modified in 1930 and again in 1936. They were called the London Treaties. So you have the London Naval Treaty, and then you have the second London Naval Treaty in 1936 to try and modify this ratio because they knew Italy and Japan were very unhappy with it. But in the 1930s, Italy and Japan basically said, the heck with it. We're not bothering with it. We don't care about your treaty. And they sort of excused themselves from any involvement in this deal because they hated it. The Kellogg-Briand Pact is passed in 1928, and this was an effort by 62 nations in the world to guarantee peace. Right. And it basically outlawed war. It basically outlawed any aggressive move towards another country. Well, how are you going to enforce that other than going to war? So it was nice in theory that they outlawed war, but it doesn't really work. And this is passed in 1928. The Secretary of State at the time is Kellogg for the United States, and that's who the first part of the treaty is named after. Now, as far as the economy goes, the tariff. So farmers were screaming in this country that they couldn't sell their goods and they could not make any money on the marketplace because there was too much production and not enough demand, so supply and demand was off kilter. So they call for Congress to pass a higher tariff to protect their goods. So Congress obliges and says, no, okay, we'll do that. We'll pass a higher tariff. So the Fordney-Mccumber tariff is passed. It takes the tariff from 27% to 38.5%. That's a huge rate. It's really a high tariff. And this is bad news for everyone. It's bad news for manufacturers here, okay, because our goods aren't really protected. It's bad news for farmers. It's bad news for Europe, because what Europe does is they say, you want to charge 38.5% an increase over our prices in order to protect your goods? Fine. We'll pass a tariff too. And various countries in Europe decided to pass their own tariff, which competed with this one, which meant that we couldn't sell our goods over there. So it hurts everybody. It's not good to have this higher tariff at this time. Now, Harding's administration is known for the scandals that erupted during his administration. He has one of the most scandalous political careers in history, as far as not directly being involved in them, like Grant. He was sort of separate, but his people were involved in these things. So there are two major scandals that break out. One is absolutely immense. The other one, so the first one is we'll get the one out of the way first. So Colonel Charles Forbes, he's in charge of Veterans Affairs in this country, and he is found to have stolen, embezzled a couple of $1 million from the Veterans Administration. That's a lot of money back in the day. $2 million back in the day, that translates to tens of millions of dollars today. So he was found to be involved in that. The Teapot Dome scandal, that's the big one. This one breaks out because there was a transfer of land. Now, we had certain oil reserves set up in the United States. There were two in California, Buena Vista and Elk Hills, and there was one in Wyoming, Teapot Dome, which is where the scandal gets its name. And our Navy had converted from being a coal-powered Navy to an oil-powered Navy. So because we're oil-powered, the United States government decided to take certain oil reserves and put them aside for the production of oil for the Navy. Well, that's great, but now that we've disarmed and we don't have as many boats and we're not at war, we may not need as much oil. So the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, convinces the Secretary of the Navy, Charles Denby, to transfer the ownership or control of the land from the Navy Department. They owned these oil reserves because it benefited them. Fall convinces him to transfer the control over to the Department of the Interior. And Denby's a little bit resistant to do that. He hesitates, but he's convinced by those around him that it's no big deal, just go ahead and do it. So he transfers the ownership or the control over to the Secretary of the Interior. Secretary of the Interior says, well, we don't need all this oil for our Navy because we don't have that many boats in the water anymore and we're not really running all over the world. So I can probably make a deal with some oil companies so that they can harvest that oil and use it for their benefit and sell it. So he makes a deal with two oilmen, Harry Sinclair from Sinclair Oil and Edward Doheny, who ran Panamanian Oil. These guys convince him to lease out the land. Now, the lease is legal. There's nothing wrong with them leasing out the land to oil companies to make a profit. Here's the problem. They got a really good deal. They paid a very low lease rate for these lands and they made a ton of money. But what they did instead of paying the government for the lease of the lands, they gave a kickback to Albert Fall to the tune of hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's about $400,000, which translates today to about $5.2 million. Yikes. So Albert Fall really sort of started living the high life, and he takes the money and he invests in his cattle ranch, and he invests in his home, and he buys a new mansion, and people are kind of like, wait, what? How do you afford all these things? Because you're just the Secretary of the Interior, you make a nice salary, but how do you afford all of this grandiose stuff? And when they started doing an investigation, Robert La Follette, remember him from Wisconsin? He was in charge of the Senate investigation on this, and what he really wants to find Albert Fall innocent, but it doesn't work out that way. When they start looking at the paper trail, all of a sudden Robert La Follette's office is ransacked because they're trying to steal any investigative material that he had, and so he gets really suspicious that he's on the right track, and when they start investigating, they figure out that Albert Fall is just guilty of taking a bribe. So it goes to Albert Fall is indicted, as are these two. Albert Fall gets sentenced to a $100,000 fine, not bad when you make $5.2 million, and he goes to jail for a year. Sinclair is sentenced to a $100,000 fine for lying to the government, and he goes to jail for 6.5 months. Doheny is found to be not guilty. He was relieved of any type of penalty that he would have to pay. Now, in August of 1923, Harding dies. So he's about 2+ years on the job, 2.5 years on the job, and he dies. He dies of pneumonia and so forth. He went on a speech-making tour. He tries to mend the fences here. And when he was in California giving some speeches and so forth, he gets really sick, and they can't get him back to Washington in time, so he dies in California.